Oh man, beautiful people. Welcome to another session of Howard's University. I am so honored and blessed to be here with this incredible man and teacher and mentor of mine and an amazing friend. And just, I need to give him a name because he name drops books. Like, y'all should just have your paper and pen ready because I can't keep up with all the books he names. Okay, so if you're watching and he names a book, just put it in a comment and I'll put it up. But Dr. Howard Fuller is with us today. How you feeling, man?
Hey, I'm good, brother. I'm blessed. And again, I want to thank you for this opportunity that you've created for us to do this work. And, you know, we got this one and one more. And then we're going to have to figure out how to go way beyond that. But
I'm with it.
I just want to begin though by thanking you for the opportunity and to thank all of the folks who've decided to look in on us today. And so I just want to explain to people, you know, maybe some people join us for the first time. This has been a three-part session, as it turns out, on the civil rights movement. And we kind of use the years 1953 up through 1968. And what we talked about really is sort of the conditions of Black people during that period of time in the South. We also spent some time in the last session talking about, you know, the difference between an objective, the strategy to reach the objective, and then the tactics that people use to try to make the strategy work. And so where we're going to go at today, and this is going to be the last session on the civil rights movement, is I want to talk to you all specifically about some of these events that exemplified the various tactics. And as we've said before, you know, obviously we can't get into the total detail on all of this stuff. And so the goal is to bring some of this to your attention. And for those of you who are truly interested, that you begin to do your own in-depth research to go further than where we're able to go in the session. And I particularly want those of you who are educators to be thinking about ways that you can take this information back to our students, whether you have to do it online or one day a week or whatever that form is that we have to take. And by the way, let me just say this. Anybody who's listening to me, do not listen to what Donald Trump says about anything. And so if we have to understand that this man don't give a damn about our lives. And so when he comes on and says, everybody go back to school, you should know that that is not what we should do. That we got to figure out not what is best for the economy, which I understand, but the first thing is what is best for the lives of our children, their life, and the lives of the teachers who are going to be working with them. And so whatever these fools are talking about, we have to begin by understanding that we're on our own, that we're going to have to come up with ways to protect ourselves and protect our children. So whatever the particular design is that's going to work at your particular school or in your particular community, it should begin with, at least in my opinion, the safety of our children. I understand, and I think we all understand, how important it is for families to get back to work. But one of the things that we know is a lot of our families, the ones who were not laid off or furloughed or whatever, that they already been working, man. You know, all of a sudden our people became essential workers. But what you also know is that, at least for a lot of our high school students, a lot of them became essential workers during this COVID-19 thing. And not just essential workers for the society, but essential workers for their families, because so many of their parents lost jobs and so forth, and they were really the only ones working to bring income. So even when you do online instruction, it's not like you can do that in the absence of life realities. That our children, or vast majority of our children, are facing on a day-to-day basis. And what I think is also important to understand is that when you start talking about sending our kids back to school, and you start talking about make sure that they have masks or they do social distancing, any of y'all who have kids know that social distancing,
not a thing for a child.
You know, and if you got little kids, elementary school teachers, can you imagine little kids like wearing a mask all day? You know, some of them can't blow their nose, some of them don't. I mean, it's just that these people talk about this as if kids are not kids. And so when you listen to some of these fools talk, you got to know that, number one, they don't have our best interests in mind. Number two, they have no idea what the hell they're talking about, because they have never dealt with schools in the way that those of you who are in schools. And so that's got to tell you, whatever it is we do, in some ways, we're going to have to design it based on what is really best for our children and our teachers and the other people, the bus drivers, the people who serve the food, all of these people, right? We have to be concerned about their health and welfare. So I'm just throwing that out.
Well, I mean, I'll just even add there. I mean, just for what they're trying to throw our children back into, let's just be very clear. This virus is so virile and deadly that they have let prisoners out of prison early in fear of their lives. The NBA is slated to start back on July 30th, and they have to get tested every single day, right? So we see how other industries are taking this very, very seriously, and we want to throw poor children. But let's just also say this too, like most of the children that they are talking about that this will be impacting tend to look like us and tend to be poor. And it's just it's just not okay to use our kids, to use children as just as political pawns, man. And I said this on A Black Hands. I can't draw strong lines to it yet, Dr. Fuller, but it feels like when I was researching the Tuskegee syphilis trials, where it just I don't have the direct lines, but you know when something just kind of in your spirit and you feel it, it's like it feels nasty like that. It feels like something we'll be studying 50 years from now, and people will be like, "Oh my God, how did they let that happen?"
Right. But and I think you raised a really important thing too, Charles, and that is that one of the things that happens to you is when you're actually living something, it's not history yet. You know, it's history, 25 years from now, right? But so the little kids that we're talking about bringing into school today, they're going to be the ones who are going to be doing an analysis of what the hell was y'all thinking back in 2020 when y'all told us to come back to school and people died and blah, blah, blah. So the people who are going to be calling us to task for what we do or don't do at this moment in time are these little kids, because they're going to be the ones who are going to be writing the history of this moment. And none of us want them to write a history where they say we abandoned them or we listened to a racist like Donald Trump,
right,
making decisions about what we should do for our children and for our community. So anyway.
Yeah, and I know we got to get started.
We could have a whole show on just.
I know, but I think this is going to lead really well into what we're talking about today. But before we get started, one last thing, Dr. Fuller, you did an amazing show yesterday with 3 really, really amazing folks, and I just want to show some love. I think they just changed the name to the podcast, but it's Tanisha Peoples is one of the hosts there. Along with Nehemiah and I think Mr. Allen, and it was great, and I'm just really, really proud of them, and I hope people are going and checking out their show. I think Tanisha is here, so Tanisha, please put the link and the name of the show in here so we can promote it for you. I thought it was amazing, and I'm so glad, I'm so happy that this sister is sharing her voice, because she's one of the most brilliant people I know, and sometimes, good people, we don't get to hear from them that much. So, and I think you did an amazing job, Dr. Fuller, on that show. Let me bring you. All right, so let's hop in, because you wanted to hop in at a bus boycott, but not the one that everybody normally thinks. Right. You wanted to start somewhere else. You want to explain?
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about tactics and tactics as reflected in specific actions or movements that tie back into, the legal tactics, the electoral politics tactics, the mass action tactics, the service tactics, and the economic tactics. Those are the 5 tactics that we talked about. So I want to begin with the Baton Rouge bus boycott in 1953. And so what happened, obviously, was the normal process for those of you who, I know you know about Rosa Parks, and we're going to get to her, but the thing was, if you wanted to ride the buses in the South, you had to either go into the back. In some places, you couldn't go through the front door. You actually had to go through the back door and then walk up to the front, put your money in, and then go back and sit down, in the back. So this was the situation in Baton Rouge in 1953. So what happened was Black people petitioned the city council, and they passed what they called an ordinance 2222 was the ordinance that got passed. And what they said was that Blacks would come from the back, but there were no reserved seats just for Black people, and white people would come from the front. But the bus drivers who were white, they refused to accept ordinance 2222. So they said, no, we don't care what you all say. This is illegal because it violates the segregationist laws of the state. It's almost like what the sister's dealing with in Atlanta right now as the mayor, where she's like, hey, governor, you're a fool. It's clear that you're a fool. You were a fool the first day you stood up in front of a mic and say that you didn't know that the virus could be transmitted by people who were asymptomatic. He didn't know that. He's a fool. So she's at war with him because he's saying you don't have the authority to do what's best for the people of Atlanta, because I done told you that you have to leave everything open. So you have the same situation here, where the city council agreed on a certain thing, but then the bus driver said you can't agree to that because it violates a state law. So what happened when the bus drivers refused to go along with what occurred is Black people organized themselves and formed a group called the United Defense League. And it was a coalition because it was an organization of organizations. And they had a lot of mass meetings. They did a lot of the stuff that you remember from Montgomery. They had car lifts. They passed the hat. And their demand was that seats be given on a first come, first served basis. No reserved seats for anybody. When you got on the bus, you took a seat wherever there was a seat. And so their bus boycott lasted 7 days. And what happened is the white folks came to the table and said, oh, no, we got to end this bus boycott. And so here was the compromise, quote, victory. The compromise victory was that there would be, if you can think of the bus, and so when you come in the front of the bus, there are these 2 seats that are on the side, these kind of long benches on the side. And then you get to the 2 seats, in rows. So the way that they did it was that the 2 seats in the front were reserved for white people. And then they had a long seat in the back that was reserved for Black people. But there was no reserved seats anywhere in between. You feel me? So that the victory was a reserved seat in the back for Black people, the 2 reserved seats in the front for white people, but then the rest of the seats were on a first come, first served basis. And for all of y'all who saying, oh man, this was crazy, blah, 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 put yourself back in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1953. And you can see that this compromise represented a victory for Black people because it struck a blow at the very nature of segregation. So you can study the Baton Rouge bus boycott in more detail. You can find out more about who the people were that were involved in it and all of that. But I don't want people to leave here without understanding that there was a bus boycott prior to Montgomery. And it was the Baton Rouge bus boycott. And that Black people did achieve a victory in that battle. So let's start with the Baton Rouge bus boycott. This is an example of a mass struggle tactic, as we talked about last week. Let's move now to one that everybody's familiar with, and this is going to be the legal one, and it's the Brown decision. One of the things, there have been two things that have struck me over the years, Charles, when I talk to people about the Brown decision. The two things that have struck me is there are a lot of learned people who've actually gone to school, man, and did not know that the Brown decision was not a single case, that it was 5 cases rolled up into one. Didn't know that. The second thing a lot of people didn't know is the thing you got on the bottom of the screen is that there were 2 Brown decisions, Brown 1 and Brown 2. And, you know, from having spent a lot of time over this last year really delving deeply into Brown, being in the law library, man, reading all of the briefs, it has just, and then, you know, the students that you had on, what they didn't tell you is that we got deep into the Brown decision, and each one of them, because there were 5 of them, each one of them had one of these cases to study. So when you talk about Brown versus the Board of Education, the first thing to realize is it was 5 cases. So you had the reason why Brown, it became known as Brown, is it was alphabetical. And you have a situation where they talked about Linda Brown and the Black children from the Topeka Board of Education, because it was really in Topeka, Kansas. And so you got Brown v. Board of Education, and this was Linda Brown. And so in that case, what Black people were asking for was enforcement of Kansas law, which permitted, but did not require cities of more than 15,000 to maintain separate school facilities for Black and white children. It didn't require that. So what they were saying, the Black people were saying, it should be integrated. And so ultimately a 3-judge panel ruled that segregation had a detriment. This is really interesting because if you go into the Topeka case, the language that appeared in the final Brown decision that Warren wrote, where it says that segregation has a detrimental effect on Black children, that was their language. But at the same time, they denied Black children any relief. So the first case you want to delve into more deeply is the Topeka case. Now, there's a lot of books you can read about Brown. The seminal book, in my opinion, on Brown is Simple Justice by Richard Kluger. And I would suggest to anybody, if you want to delve deeply into Brown, you want to get Simple Justice by Richard Kluger, and you probably want to get Richard Patterson's book, Brown versus the Board of Education. There's a lot of other books, and Charles Ogletree has, I mean, there are a lot of books out there, right? But if I was going to begin with one book, just like if anybody who's listening to us is ever going to say, I want to learn something about Black education, you read Black Education, The Education of Blacks in the South by James Anderson. You know that, Charles, because we didn't talk about it.
Well, and I did a book club on it too. So, and a lot of people that are listening delved into that book club really deep.
Anybody who says, I want to know something about Black education, you begin by reading Jim's book. And then you can read Faircloth's book. But anyway, and there's a book called A Class of Their Own that's really critical for people to read. But it's Jim Anderson's book. So I'm saying that if you want to understand Brown v. versus Board of Education, then pick up Simple Justice by Richard Kluger. I think it's about 500 or 600 pages, but it is well worth it to delve into it.
So real quick, because we're about to break this down and it's a lot, and I see people asking questions. We will get there. Somebody was saying, what's the difference between Brown 1 and 2? We're going to get there. But here are the things that you need to take away, right? Brown was not just one case. It was a series of cases rolled into one. And it got the name Brown because alphabetical order, and Brown was the first name or whatnot. And there were 2 decisions, which I have on the bottom, and we're going to delve into it. You might want to get some paper and pen. It's one of the most interesting stories I've ever heard. And it was actually when that happened, Fuller, when you gave this, I forget what state we were in. Me and Chris were like sitting there, and we were this is when Howard University was created, when we was breaking down Brown versus Board. And also, you're friends with one of it's a crazy story. And Dr. Fuller has his hands in things personally on a lot of different issues. So let's go ahead, baby. Let's roll. You ready?
Okay. Now the reason why it's alphabetical, and you might say to me, well, if it was alphabetical, then it should have been bowling. Well, the reason why it's not bowling is because the bowling case was DC, and it was decided separately, just so everybody knows. So I'll get to that. But anyway, so Brown versus the Board of Education, right? The second one is Briggs versus Elliott. This is from Clarendon, South Carolina. And the beautiful thing about this is that when you study this, you'll find out that the way that this ultimately happened was Black people were just demanding a bus, Charles. This started out as Black people saying, we want a bus for our children. Right. And this started actually in the 40s. And the reason why it's Briggs is because this brother was a mechanic. His name was Harry Briggs. And he lost his job, man. See, Charles, one of the things we got to talk about is when people start talking about, the education reform movement is the new civil rights movement of our time. You need to be careful, man, when you start making those assertions. Because ain't none of y'all losing no job because you out here standing up for Black people. And you ain't getting shot at because you trying to open up a school for Black people. Now, you may get a Facebook posting against you or a Twitter rant, but shit, ain't nobody shooting at you. And so when you start making these comparisons, man, let's be real about the difference. I'm not saying that what you're going through is not important, but I'm just saying these people, their livelihoods, their homes were burned down for standing up talking about the rights of Black people. So Briggs versus Elliott is really important to understand. All of them are important to understand. But what happened in Clarendon, South Carolina? And a piece of this I would ask you all who are going to do more research on this is that you want to look at how the Dahl case was used in South Carolina. You all know the Dahl case is Kenneth Clark, right? Remember, this is part of the research that the NAACP used. And one of the things you need to understand about the Brown decision and also the Mendez case, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but those decisions were a change in how people began to attack issues in court. Because what they began to do was not just to talk about the legal precedent, like what previous laws, because whenever you read these briefs, you're going to hear about Plessy versus Ferguson. You're going to hear about Sarah Roberts, right? But it's not just those legal briefs. They began to introduce social science literature into the discussion. And so if you read Brown, you always want to go read footnote 11, because footnote 11 is where all of the social science literature is. American Dilemma, the speech that Kenneth Clark gave at the White House conference that referenced the Dahl study. So you got all of this social science literature in there, right? So Kenneth Clark, one of the things that the NAACP brought before the court was Kenneth Clark's study about the Dahls. But you want to read the analysis of the Dahls information by Davis. He was the attorney for South Carolina, man. He ripped the Dahl study up and down, man. So just Understand that. Okay, so Briggs versus Elliott. Let me just go faster. Davis versus the county school board. This was Prince Edward County, right, in Virginia. And what's really interesting about this particular case was this case started out as Black students demanding that they build a new Black high school. And so this sister, who was an 11th grader, led a walkout of the Black students demanding that they build a new high school. But when they went to the NAACP for help, okay, so let me go backwards. You all need to understand that it wasn't until 1950 that the NAACP made a decision to go for all-out integration. Prior to 1950, they were in essence trying to make Plessy work. They were demanding equal pay for Black teachers. They were demanding equal facilities, right? So they were trying to make Plessy work. It was at a meeting in 1950 that people ultimately said, okay, we want to go for all-out integration. So when the young people from Prince Edward County went to the NAACP to seek help to get their Black school, NAACP said the only way we will help you is if you go for all-out integration. That's how that case came about. The fourth case is Belton versus Gebhardt. What's important to know about Belton versus Gebhardt is this was the case that Black people actually won. And this took place in Delaware, right? And it was two different women that filed the case, Bula and Belton. And I think again, this is an alphabetical thing. The reason why you see Belton is because it's BE versus BU. Mm-hmm. And Gebhardt was a dude who was on the state school board. And I think, again, it was alphabetical. His name came up first. And so that's how it became Gebhardt. But this case in Delaware were two different cases that got combined into one. But in this situation, the state actually ruled in support of the Black folks. And so the other three cases we lost. The Belton versus Gebhardt case we won. The fifth case, and the reason why it's not talked about in the same way, was the Bowling case, which was DC. And the reason why it wasn't brought up in the same way and it was a separate decision that got rolled into Brown is because of DC's status as not being a state. And so you got to remember that DC then was dealt with as a federal case, not as state cases coming before the federal court. So Warren ruled on that case separately, but all five of those cases got rolled together in what is known as Brown v. Board of Education 1. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's Brown 1.
So that is people asking. So
five, Brown 2.
It's all good. Five cases made up Brown 1. Okay, this is the first part of it. So when you hear people reference Brown versus Board, it's somewhat flippant. They're kind of mashing in two cases into one. But right now we just broke down what Brown 1 is and the cases that made up into that piece. And then we'll talk about what came out of that and then all this stuff. So go ahead, Doc.
Right. So Tanisha, on your question about were there any motivations and agendas behind the ask for integration, what I tried to say is that if you go back and look at the South Carolina case, and the Prince Edward case in particular, none of those cases started out asking for integration. Neither of those two cases.
Right.
In the one case, they were trying to get a new Black school bill. In the South Carolina case, they were just trying to get a bus for Black children. But then because of the NAACP saying, if you want our help, you have to go for all-out integration. Whereas like in the Belton case and in the Brown case in Topeka, they started asking for the integration of schools. And what was behind it, Black people had different reasons for asking for integration. And if you've ever listened to some of the oral interviews, and I have, of like Linda Brown's parents, they will tell you it wasn't because they wanted to be with white people necessarily. It was that they just did not feel that they should be denied anything because they were Black. That if they wanted to go to a particular school, they felt they should have the right to go there. There were other Black people who did this because they felt like their schools were inferior. And that's a true thing. If you go back and look at the Clarendon County case, and you look at what were the conditions of Black schools versus the conditions of white schools, and you get an understanding about why Black people were making these demands. But initially, the demands were to put more money into our schools. In fact, when you study the Clarendon case, you will find out that what the state did to try to curtail the suit was they created a fund to put all this money into it to build new Black schools so they could make the argument that even though they were separate, they were equal. So so there was a lot of different like motivations that Black people had, during that period of time. But let's move on. So Brown too. Most of you all who've heard anything about Brown, like if you studied it in high school and college or wherever you studied, you will hear all deliberate speed, right? That's a big term. That did not come out of Brown 1. What came out of Brown 1 was anything that is all Black is inherently unequal, which is what I always took issue with about Brown 1. So Brown 1 was, hey, what you all are doing is illegal. It's illegal to segregate kids. Brown 2 was, now that we decided that it's illegal to segregate kids, we now have to come back and make a decision on implementation. That's what Brown 2 was, an implementation decision. And in trying to have that implementation decision is when the justices said that you must do this with all deliberate speed. Mm-hmm. And that's what came out of Brown 2. In 1955, right? There's a lot behind that, but just to keep this moving, that was essentially what Brown 2 was about, was all deliberate speed. And what you really want to do is you want to read the Southern Manifesto, which came about when the Brown decision was made. We don't have time to go into that, but here's 5 cases I want you to potentially do some research on as you begin to study Brown. The first one is you want to look at Sarah Roberts. That's from 1849 in Boston. And Sarah Roberts was a young Black girl living in Boston. And again, I won't go into all the details, but Boston at that time had 2 schools set up for Black people in the city of Boston. Sarah Roberts' father wanted her to go to the white school. And in essence, they said no. And so it went up to the Supreme Court, and they ruled in favor of the school district that they had the authority to set up schools for colored children. This is in Boston in 1849, Sarah Roberts' case. Everybody heard about Dred Scott, but you should really study the Dred Scott case because it's an interesting case, and you all know that it centers around what happens if you were in a slave state, but your master took you to a free state. When you went to that free state, did that end your period of slavery? So that's what the Dred Scott case was about. The third case is the one that is really quoted time after time after time, and that's Plessy versus Ferguson. And that's the case, obviously, where this, he was a biracial dude, Herman Plessy, refused to leave the colored only part of the train. And that led to Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the sort of seminal case that made the decision that you can have separate but equal. Mm-hmm. But a case that folks should know about, and you were there, Charles, when I raised this, I think, at the conference, and that's the Mendez case. So in 1947, Mexican Americans in California sued for integration. And what's the connection here is, number one, the NAACP put in a brief on the Mendez case. But what's also important is that Earl Warren was the governor of California when the Mendez case was filed. And the Mendez case, they ruled in favor of the Mexican people, and Earl Warren did not try to overturn that decision. And then he went on to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But there's also a series of cases like the Lum case and all that had to do with colleges. Because one of the things the NAACP did was that before they tried to attack elementary and secondary education, they had made a decision, let's go at integration of colleges. Mm-hmm. And they have a whole rationale for why they decided to go in that direction instead of elementary and secondary. And so one of the cases I would ask you all to look at is the McLaurin versus Oklahoma State case in 1950. And that really had to do with this brother who was trying to get in graduate school. And there's actually pictures of him, Charles, like they let him in, but he had
like off to the side.
There's a wall. They actually had a wall. And then he could only eat in certain places in the cafeteria and all of that. Mm-hmm. So that McLaurin case is an interesting case. So there's so much to talk about if we're going to talk about Brown, but we got to move on. So but I'm hoping that you all will do some research on Brown. And it's just, as I've studied it, I'm just like overwhelmed now by, man, what Black people have gone through in this country, man. To have Negroes today standing up next to Donald Trump, it's incomprehensible to me, man. That anybody who knows the pain and suffering of our people would stand next to a racist fascist who's literally making decisions that are killing our people on a day-to-day basis. I'm just...
Well, I mean, I think you just did a great synopsis, and those are a lot of cases. One thing that I want to bring to kind of tie this back is just so you know what you want. We wanted you to take from it. Brown 1 was that anything that's all Black is deficient. Basically, that's what came out of Brown 1. Yeah. And let me, if you live in New York, if you live in Oakland, if you live in Detroit, if you live in Chicago, right? You're seeing this as gentrification. So what people call integration at times, right, is not really the thing that they mean. It is an excuse to say it's too Black here. We need to kind of break this up. So in places where I lived in North Oakland, which Black people didn't know that they were sitting on gold, right? And they got these people to sell their homes or whatever. They took this thing in the name of integration, and we had all kind of magazines talking about Oakland being the most diverse city. But what it really meant was we went from being a Black city to excavating our Black people out of the city. And now we're saying that it is now better. Better doesn't have to mean less Black. So that's from Brown 1. Brown 2 was a little bit different, and it was talking about all deliberate speed. Now, real quick before we move on to the next point, Dr. Fuller, can you just crystallize why that term is so important and the significance of it?
Right. So the significance of it is that white people took all deliberate speed to mean never. So that each state got to define what constituted all deliberate speed, right? And so you got to understand that even though people will try to tell you that the Supreme Court makes legal decisions, there is no such thing as a legal decision absent political realities. Mm-hmm. And so what they tried to do was to thread the needle because of the eruption of white people. That's why you got to go read the Southern Manifesto. And you got to understand, and my friend Gerard Robinson brought that to my attention years ago, to really look at that statement that these Congress people made, and how that became the symbol of defiance of Black people against Brown, both Brown 1 and Brown 2. So deliberate speed had to do with, we're not going to tell you, you got to get this done in a year, right? You don't have to get this done in 6 months, but you need to get it done with all deliberate speed, which was a wink to a lot of racist white people who said deliberate speed is never. And so that was the significance of that terminology. So, but let's move on. So now we want to go to the Montgomery Bus Boycott, right? So for those teachers out there The first thing I want you to do when you teach the Montgomery Bus Boycott is I want you to get this book right here. This is Claudette Colvin's autobiography, right? It's Claudette Colvin, Twice Towards Justice. Beautiful book, got pictures and stuff in it. And you know, I used it with sophomores, and it works. And so the reason why you need to start with Claudette, well, actually, Charles, this is important for people to know that in 1952, brother, I think his name was Harris, was his last name. It cost a dime to ride the bus in 1952. He put his dime in. They told him to go sit in the back of the bus. This is in Montgomery. And he refused to do it. And they called the police on him. And guess what? He ended up dead. Guess what the reason was? Because he resisted arrest. You ever heard of that? So this was in 1952 in Montgomery. And it was because he refused to go sit in the back of the bus after he had paid his dime. That's why we need to study the history of this, because the reason, again, let me try to be clear. I start with Claudette Colvin because I want young people to know that before Rosa Parks was arrested, this 16-year-old named Claudette Colvin was arrested. And what people don't realize is that there was a committee created after she got arrested to talk to the city council or the city commission to get some kind of statement on policy on what the seating arrangement was, and that they wanted the bus drivers to be more courteous. Nothing came of that. So then on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. You heard all kinds of things. Oh, she was tired. Rosa Parks was not tired. She was probably tired of being oppressed, tired from work, but that wasn't the reason she didn't give up a seat. Rosa Parks was an activist. And what y'all need to realize is that Rosa Parks was actually thrown off of a bus in the 1940s for refusing to give up her seat. And you know what was interesting about it? It was the same bus driver that was driving the bus this time. So that wasn't the first time that Rosa Parks had confronted this issue. But on December 1st, 1955, you got, first of all, Claudette arrested in March. Rosa Parks get arrested December 1st. And there's a whole lot of reasons why they chose to unite around Rosa Parks and not around Claudette Colvin. But like you and I talked about, Charles, it wasn't because she was pregnant. That was not true. But anyway.
Well, Tanisha asked a similar question too. So
yeah,
I mean, you can clear that up because I think there's because I had that belief as well. So I was told that, I read that before too. So
no. What happened was she was not thought to be a good representative for a couple of different reasons. Number one, she had, quote, a foul mouth. Number two, she was a teenager. Number three, she didn't come from the right families. Because you got to remember, there's still a class issue in here. But she talks about in her book how people said that when she got arrested that she was pregnant, that wasn't true. She got pregnant after that. And the dude was married. And so there was a whole bunch of scandal and stuff that went on. And she had to leave Montgomery and come back. So we need to clear that up. It wasn't because she was pregnant at the time. But the idea that she wasn't a good representative was because she was young. They said she was foul-mouthed because she was cussing at the people while they were dragging her off the bus. And she didn't come from the right families and all of that. So again, you can get into the study of that, Tanisha. But that's
wild too.
That's really what happened. So, but in any event,
that's wild. But yeah.
But what we need to know about Rosa Parks is that she had organized the local NAACP council in the 40s, and she had reorganized it in 1954. And they had been trying to get books from the library. They took rides in the front of segregated buses. So there was a little bit, there's some history to this before the December 1st thing happened. And so people need to study about E.D. Nixon, who was the head of the NAACP at that point in time. But really probably the most important thing is to understand the role of the Women's Political Council that was over at Alabama State College, because those were the women who got this whole thing going once Rosa Parks got arrested. You know, they started doing the leaflets. They started doing all of the political work to get all of this started. And so ultimately, Nixon met with Abernathy because those were the two kind of progressive ministers at that time. And they ended up creating this organization of organization that became the Montgomery Improvement Association. And the reason why Martin Luther King was selected to be the head of it was because he was new in town. And he hadn't created enough enemies yet amongst his brethren. And I think they also thought that they could control him. I'm not really sure about all of that. But what's clear is that he was a new minister in town. They made a decision that he could speak and he was all of these things. But the main thing was he hadn't been in town long enough to have all these people mad at him. So they So they made a decision to make Martin Luther King the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association. So you all know
and when we get a chance, I know that I just want to, and I know to it, but Miss Joseph was asking if she'd like to hear your thoughts on the advantages of integration. So
okay, so
I know you have a lot to say there. So yeah.
So let me say something real quickly about integration. I mentioned on Tanisha's show yesterday. I may have mentioned on this show before. Here's a book I want you all to read, especially all you educators, but any of y'all really. It's The Lost Education of Horace Tate by Vanessa Siddle Walker. And here's one of the reasons why I want you to read it. There's two reasons. One is because it's just a very interesting book on Black organization, what Black people had to do back during that time to organize themselves. But in 1967, the Georgia Teacher Education Association, which was the Black organization of educators in Georgia, they invited Martin Luther King Jr. to come give the keynote speech at their annual meeting. And Martin Luther King Jr., who a lot of people like to talk about, his I Have a Dream speech, which really to me was not his most powerful speech. But in any event, he got up and said, look, I think that a lot of Black people, he called them Negroes back then, and a lot of our white friends look at integration as a numbers issue. I look at it as shared power. I do not support integration that means Negro annihilation. I am not one who wants to integrate himself out of power. So when people start talking about integration, I want you to make the distinction between desegregation and integration, because they're not the same thing. Desegregation is shuffling bodies. In theory, integration means you being brought into something, and there's, like Martin Luther King said, shared power. What integration in America has meant has not been shared power. It's just like when you talk about diversity. We all diverse, but the white people sitting in the room got all the power. All we doing is bringing color to it. And if some of y'all are brave enough to talk, because some of us, when we get in these rooms with white people, we just so happy to be there that we ain't about to say nothing that might cause them not to invite us back. But integration, in Martin Luther King's own words, should mean shared power. What happened to us was not shared power. What happened to us was the annihilation of our institutional arrangements. What happened during integration? There's this book that Michelle Foster wrote called Black Teachers on Teaching. And she talks about these three groups of teachers. I think she called them seniors or elders, veterans, and novices. And they were just talking about the impact of integration. Three things happened when integration occurred. Number one, Black teachers lost their jobs. Black schools were closed, and Black teachers' opinions were devalued. Three things happened with ed reform. Black schools have been closed, Black teachers' opinions have been devalued, and Black people have lost their jobs. So over and over again, man, no matter what the thing is in this country, if we're not vigilant and if we're not in the whole posture of self-determination, we always get squashed. Even stuff that's supposed to help us, man, we get squashed in the process because we don't understand that unless you fight for self-determination, you ain't getting none. And so I just want to make sure that people understand like what this meant, what quote integration as a general concept meant during that period. But anyway, so again, study the Montgomery Bus Boycott. You all know what happened. You know, it went on. I think the decision to end the boycott was made like in December. The boycott officially ended December 20th, 1956. So it was really 381 days. And the thing to remember is that you can talk all you want about Martin Luther King, and we should. We should always talk about Martin Luther King. But we should talk about the masses of people, man. Because if so-called regular Black people have said, I don't care what y'all say, we're gonna ride the bus, you ain't got no Montgomery Bus Boycott. It was the people who sacrificed, man. Some of them lost their jobs. People walked miles to go to work. Black people organized themselves and had these cars picking people up. They were being harassed by the police all the time that this was going on, but they stuck to it for 381 days. And it was that unity of purpose that led to the victory of desegregating the buses in Montgomery. But they weren't just talking about the buses. They were also talking about jobs downtown. They were talking about other economic factors. That dovetails into that economic tactic that we talked about, because the bus boycott was a mass action, but it was a mass action that had an economic impact. And it was that economic impact on the bus system in Montgomery and the demands that they were making about jobs that led to that victory. And there was a court decision in November of 1956 that was also part of it. But once you do the research on it, you'll find all that out. So let me just move quickly. Okay, so another whole series of things that I want you all to look into was the integration of the universities in Mississippi, which really started taking place between 1956 and 1965. Now, the one thing that you all hear about all the time, and you should, is James Meredith, because it was Meredith getting shot that led to the marches that took place in Mississippi, that led to Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and Willie Ricks, and all of the SNCC people getting involved. And that's ultimately how the Black Power movement got started. But that's another thing. And the Panthers were also a critical part of that, but we ain't on that right now. So the integration of the universities between 1956 and 1965. So before you study James Meredith, you should know about Clyde Kennard. So Clyde Kennard, in 1956, he was a Korean War veteran, and he tried to enroll in Mississippi Southern College. It's now called the University of Southern Mississippi. And he tried to do that under the GI Bill. There was a dude named Dr. William McLean, who was a college president, and they tried to prevent his enrollment, first by going to Black leaders and telling Black leaders, y'all should be trying to stop this man from trying to integrate our colleges. So he was arrested twice on trumped up charges. And he was ultimately, man, sentenced to 3 years hard labor in Mississippi. This ain't, 3 years hard labor in Mississippi.
Chain gang.
Yeah, have you ever heard about Parchment Prison? So in any event, so understand, Clyde Kennard, because Clyde Kennard came before James Meredith, because Meredith didn't come until 1962. And that's when he tried to get into the University of Mississippi. It led to the march. And so again, you want to study that, but at least know about Clyde Kennard. So you had that whole period between 1956, 1963 or 62, when people were trying to integrate universities in Mississippi. So that's a whole series of actions. Okay, let me go faster. Then, of course, the one that a lot of you all know about was 1957, the Little Rock Nine. That was the effort to desegregate high schools in Little Rock. And, you know, our sister, Virginia Walton Ford, who, you know, has a movie out about her, you know, based on her experiences in DC starting the parent choice movement. She can talk to you at length about what happened then. And the sister, Lisa Frazier Page, who worked with me to write my book, she wrote an autobiography of one of the Little Rock Nines. I think it was Carlotta, that she wrote about. So again, you all can study the Little Rock Nine. That was the effort to integrate the high school, Central High School in Little Rock. Then, but what I want you to get to is the sit-ins. And this is particularly important for the young people out there, right? And most people will always zero in on February 1st, 1960, when the 4 students sat down at the Woolworths lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 students from A&T, Joseph McNeil, Franklin McLean, David Richmond, and Ezell Blair Jr. were the 4 students who sat down at that lunch counter. But if you spent time in North Carolina, as I did, and you lived in Durham, the first thing people in Durham are going to tell you about is the sit-in at the Royal Cream Ice Cream Parlor. They will tell you, and they're still mad about that they sat in at that ice cream parlor prior to the Greensboro sit-in on February 1st, 1960. And I got to give mad props to all my peeps down in North Carolina, in Durham, because they know I love them. So I got to put their stuff out there. But the one that most of y'all know about is February 1st, 1960 in the Woolworths. And so that sit-in at the Woolworths lunch counter spawned all of these sit-ins that were essentially led by college and high school students all over the country. And so you want to study the sit-in movement, right, as like a critical tactical maneuver during the civil rights movement that really like brought a lot of stuff to head. So again, I don't have time to get into all the individual ones, but you start at least, if you don't want to go and look at the ice cream parlor in Durham, then start with the one with Woolworths. So, and then you remember when we mentioned, Charles, we mentioned CORE, and we talked about CORE being one of the big 5 organizations.
Yeah.
Well, CORE was at the forefront of doing another thing called freedom rides. And then ultimately SNCC got involved. But this would be where white people and black people got on the bus. And when it got to the to the southern cities, they would refuse to go to the back of the bus. And a lot of those young people, mostly young people, some older people too, were beaten mercilessly. And you should see some of the video or the films about them getting beaten. So I know we're about to end, Charles, but let me also just make sure that you look at the Birmingham Campaign in 1963-64. The Albany movement was before that, but look at the Birmingham Campaign. And there's a book that I think is really important for you all to study that pertains to the Birmingham Campaign. And I think it's called Parting of the Waters by Taylor Branch. And I think it's chapter 8, I'm not really sure, but that talks about the Children's Crusade as a critical part of the Birmingham movement. And again, for teachers to have students zero in on the role that high school and even middle school students played in making the letter to the Birmingham jail possible. So I want you to study the Birmingham Campaign. And another book to read in this regard, I mean, is I Got the Light of Freedom by Charles Payne.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things we're not going to be able to get to is the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964. When Cheney, Sherner, and Goodman were killed.
Mm-hmm.
But just the role that SNCC played in the whole Freedom Democratic Summer. And Charles talks about that, in his book. And there's a beautiful chapter on the organizing efforts of SNCC. And then you get to know a little bit more about Bob Moses, for example, who is active today with the Algebra Project.
Algebra Project, yeah.
So I know we have to end, man. So this is the end of our civil rights, our 3-part civil rights thing that started out as a 1-part thing that got into a 3-part thing. And there's still a lot more to talk about, but I'm just hoping that we've given you all, we've whetted your appetite.
Right.
We want to try to understand this period in more detail. And it's certainly something you can work with your students on.
Well, and I wouldn't even just say for Black educators. I would say for Black grandmothers that's on here, Black parents, anybody in academia, and I hate this term, but these are things that go against what's called the master narrative, the narrative of like this very docile movement with this very docile man that just believed in peace and kumbaya, right? There were actually real tactics, there were real principles, there was real sacrifice, there was real blood spilled, and there are a lot of things that happen. And also the other thing to take away from this is that even when you have the best intentions, there is a thing called a political reality of what actually happens once that thing takes into effect. And I wanted to just appreciate you, Dr. Fuller, because this is a hard thing to cover, is huge. But what he's provided you today with is what we call stems. Like all these are stems that you can kind of start doing research on, and you might even go off into a different direction and look at, hey, one of the things that I'm actually looking at right now is the way that violent movements actually help prop up the nonviolent movement as a negotiation tactic that allowed for King to even be heard. So people didn't have to deal with the uprisings that they feared that Black people was going to have. So, I think that this was just really, really valuable. And Dr. Fuller, we could do 1,000 episodes of these and there'd never be enough time. But I do want to appreciate you because we don't sit down and just talk about these histories and these stories because we don't always know them, or we know them kind of broken up. And I think you helped us build out a timeline. But what you all have to do is this requires some work on the people that's listening. You have to take some of these names and these books and these stems and do some quick Google searches, right? And I promise you'll fall down a rabbit hole, but there's so much pride to be got and to be had around our resistance and our ability to fight and to be disciplined and to actually make some changes. There are a lot of people right now that don't feel like change is possible. And it's like, nah, man, it's just a long timeline of things that in the way that it happened. So I know we had a few little technical difficulties. Dr. Fuller, you were frozen right now, but for the people that were able to stick with us, man, we hope that you got something from it. Dr. Fuller, I hope you got some water there next to you, brother, because you was preaching today. I'm so grateful to do this. And next week, I hope that you all join us again. We'll be here at the same time in the same places. Do us a favor, and if you enjoyed this, please like it, please share it. You share like a personal message in it that will bring people here to these conversations. So we just want to provide some knowledge for our people, man. So for Dr. Fuller, this is Dr. Charles III, and we are signing off for the day for Howard University, and we will see you all next time. Peace.
And power, brothers and sisters.
And power.
Absolutely.
And